Then the all-creating sovereign proclaimed in person that the ground of all things is the all-creating one herself. O great Bodhisattva, listen! I, the all-creating sovereign, am the mind of perfect purity of everything. This mind of perfect purity is the ground of all things. From the three aspects of my nature, that of the all-creating one, comes the fullness which fulfills all needs. The three aspects of my nature are to be known as follows: unborn, without termination, and the source for the wonder of ceaseless creation. The fullness is taught under three aspects. The fullness, which stems from the unborn nature, free of birth, reveals the ground of all things. The fullness of the own being of the teacher's three manifestations who stem from the stainless, unobstructed nature. The fullness of the three retinues' own being who stem from the actuation of the unborn wonder of creation. O great Bodhisattva, listen! My own being is the sole reality. I am the wonder of creation from which arise the three retinues due to the teacher's ceaseless three forms of manifestation. I am one in reality and suchness, and pertinent to this truth are six bases, which are methods you ought to understand. As to making doctrinal view a basis for cognizing reality, you ought to know that it is just a means to let you see reality. As the unborn is not an object which you can perceive, you will never gaze at suchness by means of a doctrinal view. As to making vows a base for purging one's own faults, you ought to know that it is just a means for removing the hindrances. As suchness is not an object which you should observe, suchness will never be mastered by means of observing any vows. As to making rites a base for spiritual realization, you ought to know that they are just a means for letting you make this realization through striving for it. As suchness is not an object which you could strive for, suchness can never be realized through striving. As to making the path a base for progress by means of proceeding on it, you ought to know that it is just a means for progressing toward the goal. As suchness is not a path on which you may proceed, suchness will not be reached through proceeding. As to making the Bodhisattva stages a base for abiding in them, you ought to know that they are just an unnecessary means of religious practice. As suchness exists in everything at all, there is no stage to be practiced so that you could abide in them. As to making the pristine awareness a base for understanding, you ought to know that it is just a means to understand reality. As suchness is never an object of cognition, the self-originated pristine awareness cannot be cognized as an object. Great Bodhisattva, listen. The mind of perfect purity is the ground of all things, but the followers of the system of causation will never encounter the unaltered ground of their own mind due to the fact that striving will adulterate suchness. This is so because each vehicle has its individual set of 6 practices and 6 doctrinal views which teach the retinues to consider causation. Then each disciple has to think what vehicle is suitable to him or her. But suchness is never an object of striving, even if they engage in striving by means of taking the 6 practices and 6 doctrinal views as base. They will never meet their own mind as the unaltered ground of the universe, as this striving adulterates suchness. O great Bodhisattva, listen. As to the teaching which says no contemplation of doctrinal views, you ought to know the following. I do not teach that the objects are unrelated to the self, because the root of all things is nothing else but oneself, and therefore it is impossible that the self looks at itself in terms of a doctrinal view. Therefore it is known as the teaching of no contemplation of doctrinal views. As to the teaching which says no observance of vows, you ought to know the following. The observance of the vows cannot obstruct one's own mind, which is the self-originated pristine awareness. Consequently, you should not observe the vows. As to the teaching which says no striving after salutary acts, you ought to know the following. Because the great perfection is beyond causation from the primordial, those who desire the results after they have accomplished the causes and forms of salutary acts will never realize the great perfection. This teaching is called no striving after salutary acts, because the great perfection cannot be desired as a result, and because the salutary acts free of striving are spontaneously perfect. As to the teaching which says no proceeding on the path, you ought to know the following. Oh, all the Buddhas of the 3 times and the sentient beings of this threefold world proceed on a path towards the mind of perfect purity. With regard to this mind of perfect purity, the Buddhas and sentient beings are not different. Consequently, there is no proceeding on a path towards this mind by means of this mind. As to the teaching which says no practice of the Bodhisattva stages, you ought to know the following. As this sole stage of the mind of perfect purity is the dimension of reality, Dharma Dhatu, those who attempt to realize it by means of practicing are bound to causation and fruition. I do not teach a lore claiming that there is a realization of this stage of the mind of perfect purity, the dimension of reality, by engaging in practicing and adulteration. As to the teaching which says no understanding of the pristine awareness as object, you ought to know the following. Regarding these objects, they are from the primordial, the self-originated awareness. Consequently, the pristine awareness cannot be an object to the pristine awareness. Such she spoke. This is the 48th chapter of the all-creating sovereign, mind of perfect purity, in which she personally proclaimed that the ground of all existing things is the all-creating herself.